Great, thank you, Kim. Hello, everyone. Welcome on behalf of the Ontario Ancestors Ireland Special Interest Group. My name is Cindy Robichaud, and thank you for joining us tonight. We have a couple of housekeeping items to get to first. Your cameras and your microphones have been turned off, but we encourage you to ask questions of the speakers by using the chat box. Your questions will be forwarded to the host, who will forward them on to Kathy, who has offered to ask the questions for us tonight. So thank you, Kathy. There will be a handout which will be put into the chat box during the presentation. And we'll try to get to as many questions as we can. So let's get started. Tonight we welcome Charmaine, Lindsay, and Laura Smith from the Canada-Ireland Foundation, which celebrates and commemorates the story of the Irish in Canada. They have undertaken an important project, and they're here tonight to tell us about it. So ladies, I'll let you take it away.
Thank you, Cindy, and thank you to the Irish Special Interest Group for asking us to speak tonight. As Cindy said, I'm Laura Smith. I'm a historian of the Irish in Canada, and in particular of the Irish in Ontario in the first half of the 19th century. And I'm also a historical consultant for the Canada-Ireland Foundation and the lead researcher for our Tracing Famine Generation in Ontario project. As Cindy said, the foundation is dedicated to celebrating the story of the Irish in Canada. The foundation built Ireland Park, which is on Erin Quay on the Toronto waterfront, to commemorate those Irish famine immigrants who perished at Toronto. And it most recently opened Dr. George Grissett Park, which commemorates the medical workers who died while treating typhus patients at the Toronto Immigrant Hospital in the summer of 1847. And we're really excited about our new project because it does something that isn't all that common when it comes to the history and commemoration of the Irish famine. We're tracing the journeys and telling the stories of the survivors rather than the victims. And even in the preliminary stages, we're finding out so many interesting things about the immigrants who arrived in the summer of 1847 and starting to find out that they were a far more diverse group of people than we'd realized. And it's opening our eyes to the complexity of migration during the famine and of immigration management in Canada as a whole. So tonight I'll talk about the records that we're using. An amazing little known parcel of records, though it occurs to me that the more I talk about it in public, the less little known they are. But these little known parcel of records are called the Immigration Service Fund records. And I think many of you might be interested to search these records for your own projects. So after I talk about the historical context of the records, what you can and cannot find in them, and then give a few examples of the types of records, Charmaine, Lindsay, who's also from the Canada-Ireland Foundation, will give you a walkthrough of how to search the records for yourself for your own projects. And then we'll talk a little bit more about our project and about what we plan to do with the data we're collecting and how perhaps some of you might be able to help us. So the Immigration Service Fund records are held at Library and Archives Canada, and amazingly, most of them have been digitized and indexed into a rudimentary database. And it's that database that we're using as the basis for the data set for this project. And though we're focusing on 1847, the records actually cover most of the 1840s, starting in 1843, up to 1848 for sure, and there's a few kind of stragglers into the early 1850s. And so essentially these documents are receipts for expenses that were incurred by government immigrant agents. It was the job of these agents to manage the arrival and dispersal of Irish immigrants into the Canadas in the 1840s. And so these records, they detail assistance that was given ostensibly to immigrants who didn't have the means to support themselves upon arrival in Ontario. So the assistance came in form of things like food, medical treatment, shelter, coffins, and burials. But the overwhelming majority of these receipts are for transportation, which is what we're using for our project. So I'm sure you all know about Grosse Ile, the quarantine station in the St. Lawrence River. This was one of the first places at which an immigrant arriving to Canada in the early 19th century, the 1830s, 1840s and on, would have interacted with the Canadian government. So from Grosse Ile, immigrants, once they passed quarantine, they were proceeded down the river to Quebec, then to Montreal, and then by open-top barge along the St. Lawrence River to Kingston. And at Kingston, they were put on steamships and sent to ports along the north shore of Lake Ontario. And at each place, immigrants would have been triaged. The sick were sent to rudimentary hospitals. Often they were in temporary buildings, or as was the case in Toronto, to the repurposed General Hospital. And those that were sent, those that were well, were encouraged to continue on. So from Kingston, immigrants were sent on to Cobourg, they were sent on to Port Hope, Toronto, Hamilton, and Niagara, and occasionally up the Rideau Canal to Bytown. The immigrant agent at Kingston complained bitterly that the agents at Montreal didn't bother asking immigrants where they wanted to go. And as a result, he was kind of sending people all over the place. And he really wanted a little bit more organization, as you can imagine. So there are records for those trips along the lake, but the majority of records are for trips out of the port cities into the rural townships and hinterlands to the north. And so the reason for this is that essentially the government's policy at the time was that they wanted to disperse immigrants as widely as possible. And there was a number of benefits to that in their mind. It was thought that if poor immigrants could reach their friends and family, then that would bode well for an immigrant's chance of doing well in the province. And it also would lessen the potential expense to the government for a destitute immigrant support. There was also a lot of pressure and a lot of sensitivity about the extent, the visibility of poor immigrants in these towns and cities. And it makes sense. I mean, Toronto had a population of 20,000 at the time. Over almost 40,000 immigrants arrived in the summer of 1847 to Toronto. Same goes for Hamilton, a population of about 7,000, 16,000 immigrants arrived there, and Cobourg and Kingston were no different. So part of that scattering and dispersal of immigrants was about moving people on and sort of lessening the pressure on the towns and cities. And finally, the idea was that in the rural townships, there was just more potential employment for a newcomer. It was thought that agricultural labor was always in short supply, and these immigrants would make a ready pool of that. Whether that was true or not is open for debate. And so while the immigrant agents were always talking about scattering immigrants, dispersing them, what we're starting to discover in these records is that the immigrants probably had some say in where they went, where they were scattered to. We know that many immigrants who set out from Ireland, even during the famine, had some cash, some means, but many had completely depleted their savings by the time they arrived in Ontario. And therefore, free transportation was the difference between having to stop somewhere and work for a season in order to get up money again, or the ability to just continue the journey and reach their intended destination. So we have records for immigrants being moved out of Toronto, out of Cobourg, out of Hamilton, out of Kingston, Bytown, and Port Hope. From Hamilton, immigrants were sent to Brantford. They were sent to Preston, Galton, Hespeler, and Guelph. From Cobourg, in 1847 at least, they were sent to Coors Landing, which was a launch point on Rice Lake. And it was from there that they were able to access boat transportation and to travel inward into the townships to the north. And in Toronto, the majority of immigrants were sent north on Yonge Street to Newmarket, Innisfil Township, and to Holland Landing. And that was where and Holland Landing, they could access further transportation on Lake Simcoe. And others from Toronto went to Peel and Simcoe counties and York counties. So for 1847, our data set has 1,400 names of individuals and heads of households, and they represent approximately 5,000 immigrants. So these are people who were given government assistance that year. Somewhere along that point, they interacted with a government agent and they were given some sort of support. And certainly this is just a sample of the tens of thousands of Irish and others who came in 1847. But nevertheless, it's a significant sample that we think we can learn much from. So what sort of information can we find in the Immigration Service records? This is the first kind of example. It's a list of sick immigrants who are being sent to hospital from the wharf in Toronto. As I said earlier, the Toronto General Hospital at the time was repurposed as an immigrant hospital and to treat immigrants in the summer of 1847. But unfortunately, there are no records for this hospital. And so these lists are really exciting because they kind of increase our understanding of who was treated at the time, when they were sent to the hospital, how, and what's great about the hospital records in particular is that they include ages. So we can see here we have 8 immigrants who are being sent there in 17th, 18th, 19th July, and they kind of run the gamut, right? We have Michael Kelly, who's 50, and James Mallon, who's 54, down to Catherine Murphy, who's 13, Mary Lynch and Ann Duffy are in their early 20s. And so these lists for the hospital really are really exciting too, because they include names for everybody, and that's not the case in the other records. As you'll see, the other records only include heads of household. There are a few records that are also for this, there's a few records like this. These are records, for goods and services. So there's ledgers and there's receipts for things like bread being supplied to the immigrant sheds, for meat on fewer occasions, or in this case, funerary services that are being provided to immigrants. And as you can see here, this is from Hamilton in 1846. But a Richard Postel was paid 12 shillings and 6 pence for furnishing a coffin and digging a grave, to convey the remains of the son of the widow Riddle, who's a destitute immigrant. So there's fewer receipts like this, but nevertheless, this is some of the things that we can find. The majority of records look like this one. This is a transportation receipt, as you can see, and it's a receipt that was made out to an individual teamster for usually one trip. And so they include things like the place where the receipt was written out, in this case, Toronto, on the 26th of June, 1847. The immigrant agent here is Edward McElderry, who is someone that we know succumbed to typhus at the end of October in 1847. And it lists where these immigrants are being sent, in this case to Pickering, and often it gives the estimate of how far, as you can see, 21 miles. And then it gives us information about who is being transported. So we have 2 men named William Wallace and James Armstrong, and each of them are going with their wife and 3 children. So often the immigrants are grouped with their traveling companions. And often, but not always, the relationship of these people to the head of household is indicated. And not surprisingly, I'm sure you will agree, the majority of the heads of households are the oldest adult male in the party. And there's some inconsistencies in the records. It depended on the immigrant agent, it depended on the year. One of the examples of those inconsistencies is Coburg. At Coburg, the agent we don't have any of those individual receipts. We just have long lists. The agent made long lists of people he was sending. And he also didn't usually indicate how many people were in a family, unfortunately. So I don't know whether you can read this one well enough, but basically it has a name and then it says "and family." But in these cases, you can start to kind of guess at how many people are in a family just by the number of passages. So for example, if you look down on the October 17th, we have John Robinson and his family, and they're going from Coburg to Toronto on the steamer Princess Royal. Sorry. And they're 3.5 passages. So usually a child was half passage. So we could maybe surmise that this is John Robinson, his wife, and their 3 children. Another thing, another batch of records depict women. And it's clear that a significant number of women are making this journey, whether with their husbands and their children or alone or with children. And a significant number of them were heads of households, at least by the time they arrived in Ontario. And here we have 2 women. We have a widow, and as was custom at the time, unfortunately, a widow doesn't get a first name in a record, and which is, of course, is incredibly disappointing. But I actually quite like what I'm starting to see in these records, because there was a considerable amount of hand-wringing about widows in this time on the part of the immigrant agents. There was a sense that this was the group of immigrants that were the most vulnerable. They were the ones who were most likely to need government assistance. They were thought to be generally unemployable. At Toronto, they established a widows and orphans home in 1847 to house widows and orphan children, and basically to facilitate finding them employment and housing. But I think transportation records like this are sort of kind of changing my idea of what was actually going on, because they're suggesting there's more to the famine widow story than maybe the government realized. There are many, many widows in these files who are taking transportation to rural areas, to other communities other than Toronto, that suggests that they had a plan and that they were planning on doing something other than being a veritable ward of the state. And there's another woman here, Mary Laughlin and child, also going to Newmarket. And this is an example of some of the inconsistencies with how women are treated in these records. Not every immigrant agent, some immigrant agents would have added Mrs. To a record to indicate a woman was married, but not everyone did. So we can't make any conclusions about this woman's marital status. Single women do appear, single adult women do appear in the records, but interestingly, they're often with other single adult women. And it begs the question, did they meet on the trip? Are these friends that have come together from Ireland? And etc. So women are absolutely present in this migration. And the final group to talk about tonight are children. Children aren't generally named in the records because they're most often traveling in a nuclear family and it's the head of the household who's named. Unless they're being transported to hospital in this case, as is in this case. And it's kind of regrettable because children are, I think, a significant subset of the famine migration at this time. And part of the reason why they don't really show up in these records is that once an orphan was identified at Gros Isle, at Quebec, at Montreal, they were separated and superintended by the churches in those places. And of course, children would have slipped through, and we know they did, or became orphans once they arrived in Ontario, for that matter. In this example, we have three little girls, sisters, Isabella, Ellen, and Janet, 11, 8, and 6, and they're being sent to hospital on the 27th of August. And we know they're sisters because we've actually learned quite a lot about them. So if we have time, maybe I'll tell that story, which is quite lovely. So as I'm sure you can see, these records are a veritable goldmine for your research on immigrants to Ontario during this period, but also for our project. And we know that there are many, many stories just waiting to be uncovered in these records. So our project will map the movement of individuals and families who were transported in 1847. And we want to visualize the dispersal of migrants and understand how transportation assistance was an important element in an individual or family strategy for survival once in Canada. And we're interested in the extent to which people chose their destinations and how they maintained familial and friendship bonds in the face of perilous conditions. And to do this, we're looking at the group as a whole. We're looking for patterns in the demographics and mapping the movement of the whole scale movement of people in this sample group throughout the province and beyond, as the case may be. But we also want to tell individual stories where we can. We want to recount the successes and the triumphs, as well as the struggles and the tragedies. And to do that, we're using genealogy. We're trying to trace the fates of the 1,400 individuals in our data set. And so just to give you a slice of what we're hoping to find, I'll talk about a family I've been working on. So Darby Moffat and his family, his wife and 5 children, were transported to Mono, to the northwest of Toronto on June 17th, 1847. I'll note on the ticket, you can see also on the wagon was Michael Kilmartin, wife and 7, and we'll get back to him in a minute. But as I'm sure you can imagine, Darby wasn't that hard to find in the 1851 census. It turns out there's only 2 Darby Moffats in 19th century Ontario censuses, and the other one was his son. So it didn't take long to find him in Pickering Township in 1851. So interesting, they went to Mono, they ended up in Pickering. What happened in between? I found the answer in an obituary for Darby's oldest son, Brian, as you can see him listed there. He actually died at 100 years of age in Mara Township in the 1920s. And so his obituary filled in some of the details of that 4-year span. And I think the story speaks really to the incredible mobility of famine immigrants and newcomers of all origins in Ontario at this time. So the obituary revealed that the family were from Drumfad, Sligo, and that they had sojourned temporarily in New York City, where sure enough, they appear in the 1850 census. They're in Ward 6 of that city. And the obituary goes on to say, quote, not finding New York to their liking, they returned to Pickering, with the exception of 2 children who had died, end quote. And I've determined that it was Bridget, age 26, and Patrick, age 23, who did not survive the family's time in New York City. So I'm still working to uncover the further details of this family, but I think these faint traces might help illustrate how we'd like to visualize and restore the stories of the famine generation in Ontario. So we can trace their trip from Drumfad to Sligo Harbor, where, judging by the timing of their arrival in Toronto, we think they probably boarded the Jessie in April of 1847 and arrived at Grosse Ile at the end of May. So after Grosse Ile and the slow barge trip along the St. Lawrence, and then by steamer on Lake Ontario to Toronto, we can then visualize their trip north by wagging up the Gore Road to Mono Township in June of 1847. But then next we find them in New York. And how they got there, I would love to know. And Patrick's death record tells us that they lived on Mulberry Street in what is now Chinatown in Lower Manhattan. But within a few months of Patrick's death in March 1847, we find them again in Pickering. But by 1861, in another census, the family had finally stopped moving and had settled in Simcoe County in Mara Township in the vicinity of Brecon. And it's here that Darby, Nancy, his wife, and their remaining children lived and were buried. And so I have a lot of questions still about this family. A big one for me is, did they ask to be sent to Mono? Or did the immigrant agent encourage them to go there? What made them decide to leave? And another question is, did they leave the Kilmartins behind in Mono? Or did they go to New York also? I've since discovered that Darby's wife, Nancy, was named Gilmartin, a variation of Kilmartin, and a name very common in the parish of origin in Sligo. So I'm wondering, could these families been related to each other? And did they come from Sligo together? Did they travel together? How and why did Patrick and Bridget Moffat die in New York? And what compelled the remaining Moffats to return to Ontario? So it's stories like these of survival, but also of success that we hope to find. We're building a digital and physical exhibit that will, as I said, trace and map the movement of immigrants and trace the journeys of families and individuals like the Moffat throughout the province and beyond. We want to uncover compelling stories. And to do that, we have the help of amazing volunteers who are sharing their genealogical expertise and time with us. And at the end of our presentation, we'll talk a little bit about how you guys can help if you so wish. But now Charmaine is going to take over, and she's going to speak about how you can search the Immigration Service Fund records yourself for your own projects.
Thank you, Laura. And thank you also to the Ireland Special Interest Group of the OGS for allowing us to present this exciting historical and genealogical resource to you today on behalf of the Canada-Ireland Foundation. My name is Charmaine Lindsay, and I'm on the board of the Canada-Ireland Foundation and the chair of the Historical Committee, and also the volunteer coordinator for this project. I'm a retired librarian and spent a significant part of my career working at the Canadiana department in the Northrop Central Library. In that department, specialized in Ontario local history and genealogy. And I also spent some time at City of Toronto Archives. So I'm very interested in Ontario and Toronto local history and genealogy. So that now that Laura's given you an overview of the historical importance of these records and their potential to give you valuable information about your immigrant ancestors, I'm going to walk you through the process of actually searching them. Before we get into search, here are some general comments. You can find these records by searching the Immigrants Before 1865 database at Library and Archives Canada. The Immigration Service records are not the only records in the database. The database also includes some passenger lists and other government immigration records. I will show you how to identify the Immigration Service Fund records specifically. And images for the individual records do exist. Laura showed you several of them tonight, but they are not linked to the index. So later on in my presentation, I'll show you how to find the images. The index for the Immigration Service Fund records was based on an earlier card index, and in most cases only includes the name of the head of household, as Laura indicated. As far as we can tell, the index names were input as they were spelled on the original receipts. Writers of the receipts would have varied in their degree of literacy, and the literacy of the immigrants giving their names would have varied too. So there's no consistency in spelling. Unlike Ancestry and many other genealogical utilities, the index does not automatically search variants, at least not to the extent that Ancestry does. Therefore, it's very important that you try to determine as many different spellings of the names that you're searching as possible. You can use an asterisk to replace letters after the asterisk. For instance, DOG asterisk will return all the forms of Doherty, starting with DOG, but an asterisk in the middle of a word will not pull up any results. And capitalization does not matter. So let's get started. You can get to the Immigrants Before 1865 database by doing a simple Google search for Library and Archives Canada, Immigrants Before 1865. This is the landing page of the database, and we're going to click Search Database. The search page gives you the option to search for surname, first name, year of immigration, and keyword. As I mentioned, the database does not automatically search variants, so I would recommend a broad search to start with. If you come up with a large number of records, then you can narrow if you're certain of more details. We're going to do a search for the name Doherty. I will use an asterisk to find all the instances of the name that start with DOH. To do a complete search for the name Doherty, I would also have to do a search for DAU asterisk, DAC asterisk, etc., to include all the variant spellings. But for now, we'll just search DOH asterisk. We get a search result with 39 names that start with DOH asterisk. And we're going to look at the sixth name, James Doherty. You'll notice that the date of immigration is listed as 1847. This was the largest year of immigration for the famine, and falls within the date range of the Immigration Service records. To see a fuller description of the record, so I think, Laura, if you can go back one. Yes, so to see a fuller description of the record, click on the item number to the left of the name. In this case, is 2892. And this will take you to the item description page for James Doherty. Next slide. The description tells you that the record is from the Department of Finance, accounts relating to the Immigration Service Fund, 1843 to 1854. So these are the records that Laura has been telling you about. The additional information will sometimes give you a clue as to whether or not this is your family member. In this case, it tells you the receipt is for the transporting of a family from Cobourg to Gore's Landing. As Laura mentioned earlier, Gore's Landing is on the south shore of Rice Lake and was a transport point by boat northward into the townships of Peterborough County. So perhaps this family was going to join friends or family that had arrived in earlier migrations, such as the Peter Robinson settlers in this Peterborough area. Note that the top right of the item description says that 0 PDF files exist for this item. That is not true. A PDF image of the record does exist, but it's not directly linked to the database. So now I'm going to show you how to find that image. On the item description, you will find file, volume, and page number. Make a note of these, but especially the page number, in this case, 386B. This is what we're going to use to find the image. Once you have the page number, return to the Immigrants Before 1865 database landing page. Scroll down and click on List of Records. Once you click on that, a chart will open up that lists all of the records that are part of the database. And as you scroll down, you'll see that there are some passenger lists and other government records relating to immigration. But the last item on the chart is this one. This is, and you'll see a description here of the Immigration Service records that partly reads, most of the documents are accounts submitted by Teamsters and boat captains who provided inland transportation by wagon or boat to indigent poor immigrants. So these are the transportation records that we are using for our project. Click on the page range on the right that includes the page number that you noted from the item description. In this case, the page number was 386. So we would click on that page range and the computer will then begin to download all of the images from 383 to 418. So Laura, can you go back just one slide for a moment? Yes, so the computer is going to download all of these images, not just 386. So we can go on from there. Be patient. It may take a few minutes for those of you that have worked with the Library and Archives Canada website. It can take a while to download things, so keep your patience. And up pops the first in the series, 383. Next slide, and you'll notice the number on the top right-hand corner that I've circled here. This is an account to pay the driver Alex Williamson £1 to drive John Heffy, his wife, and 5 children to Stouffville on August the 13th, 1847. Notice the misspelling of Stouffville. Using the scroll bar on the right, scroll down till you reach page 386. And this image tells you that this is an account to pay George Butler. Next slide. George Butler for the transport of the following indigent poor immigrants, their families and baggage from Coburg to Gore's Landing and other places. The list begins with July 14th, 1847, with teeming John Lane and family, William Brown and family, etc. Keep scrolling down until you see the entry for James Docherty and family on July 25th. Make a note of the other families traveling on the same day to the same location. As Laura mentioned, this could be clues to family and neighbor connections from Ireland. To print the record, use the numbers at the top of the PDF file. In this case, to print only the page, this particular page, you would tell the printer to print page 9. If you just sent all of this to the printer, you'd get all 79 pages, and I'm sure people don't want to do that. The save function also results in saving all the records from page 383 to 418. So you also may not want to do this. If you don't want to save all of these records, you can either do a screenshot of just this page, use a snipping tool to capture just what you want to save, or print out the record you want and then scan it. I encourage you to try to do some searching for your own ancestors in these records. It's particularly important because, as you know, there are not very many passenger lists from this era, and these are one of few records that will identify people's actual arrival, proof of arrival in Canada. If you find one of your ancestors in these records, we would really like to hear about it. And so I'm going to put my email in the chat, and you can email me with those kind of stories. Hopefully we'll get some compelling stories that we'll be able to use in our exhibit as well. These instructions and detailed instructions are included in the handout, and Laura's going to put that in the chat as well. There will be a link to the handout on the Canada Ireland website, and the Ireland Special Interest Group are going to put it on their website as well. So now I'm going to turn it back to Laura, who's going to tell you a little bit more about the project and how you can get involved.
Video would be nice. There I am. Thank you, Charmaine. So as we said earlier, the Canada Ireland Foundation is dedicated to celebrating the story of the Irish in Canada. And after 2 projects that have commemorated the deceased, we see the Immigration Service Fund records and the stories they can tell as the logical next step to telling the Irish famine story in Ontario. And as we said, we're certain there are thousands of stories waiting to be uncovered by examining these records in detail and by cross-referencing them with other routinely generated records, newspapers, and local and family histories. And so we're asking for volunteers, experienced genealogists like yourselves, to help us search for these immigrants. We'll provide you with a list of suggested resources for a particular area in which an immigrant was sent, but we'll also ask you to draw on your own expertise, your creativity, and your knowledge of local sources. We'll provide an orientation of how we'd like the information to be compiled and stored, but we won't be providing training on genealogical methods. We're kind of hoping that you know how to do those sorts of things yourself already. You can search for as many or as few immigrants as you like. We typically give volunteers 10 names to start. And we're not asking you to do a full family tree workup on these individuals, like take them into the 21st century. We're only asking you to determine if these individuals can be located in the contemporary records. We want to trace them for about a generation, maybe until they've acquired property or until their children are grown and established, or until their death. And so the records volunteers are helping us, are finding or helping us identify individuals who we think deserve closer research and whose stories might have the potential for inclusion in our exhibit and final project. So far, we've focused our attention on all the immigrants who were transferred out of Cobourg. And so we have volunteers who are combing the records for Northumberland County, for Kawartha Lakes, and the Old Durham County. And we also have volunteers looking at York County records, and soon we'll start to look at Peel and Simcoe townships. If you'd like to help, please visit the foundation website, which is included there, and click on the link to volunteer. And I'll put the URL in the chat as well shortly. Now, I think if there's any questions, I think we've got a little bit of time left, and we'd be happy to answer them to talk about the records or about the project further. Looks like someone would like to get the handout again, which I can do. There you go. Oh, so I don't know. I haven't had a chance to see the chat as we've been talking, but Richard has asked to hear the story about the 3 sisters, so I can tell that maybe Charmaine, you can take the time to look at the chat and see what other questions we have. So the Hadwin sisters, I've got a great little slide here to finish with. Charmaine and I did a presentation, a similar one to this, to the Kawarthas branch OGS a couple months ago, and I chose to tell the story of those three sisters. I was fascinated by them because I saw them there being transported to the immigrant hospital, and I found them also in the convalescent home register, which was in a place that was set up to transfer people who were well enough to leave the immigrant hospital, but maybe weren't well enough to leave the city yet. And so we actually have a register for the convalescent home, which is absolutely marvelous. But the three girls are there in the convalescent register, and they're in the discharge column, and they're listed as having absconded. And so, of course, my mind went to an 11-year-old, an 8-year-old, a 6-year-old absconding. You know, what happened to them? That's, you know, something terrible happened to them. But in the course of this this Kawarthas branch talk, somebody in the audience said, "Well, actually, she contacted us and said, actually, she had researched this family as part of her own family research, and she sent us this marvelous picture. This is said to be a dress worn by one of those little girls on their trip across the Atlantic in 1847. And so what we found out about them is that they're English. They came from Lancashire, and they came with their parents and their older siblings. Unfortunately, they had to leave their mother behind at Groseal, where she died eventually in September. But the rest of the family made it to Toronto, but the father actually died in Toronto, not just a few days before the girls were sent to the immigrant hospital. But it didn't end it wasn't a total disaster. The girls are in the 1851 census, living with two brothers in different households in Vaughan Township. And the woman who contacted us was able to tell us that they lived to be old ladies and had many children. And obviously the family prized this dress for many, many years after. So that was a lovely thing to see. And it's those sorts of compelling stories that we want to be able to tell with this project.
So Laura, I'm seeing some questions. I think some went to Kathy as well, but I'll ask the ones that are showing up in the general chat here. First question is, do the records only contain Irish?
No, that's, you know, we shouldn't have been surprised, but that's this example here of these girls, they're from Lancashire. No, they're not just Irish, and they're not just Catholics either. And that's something that we're really interested to think about and to talk about. You know, it makes me think about sort of the far-reaching effects of that famine on it's a global event ultimately. This family from England decided to emigrate, and they happened to pick the worst, probably one of the worst years possible to do it. So yeah, that's something that's coming up. There are many English, there's many Scottish, and I wouldn't be surprised if there are other Europeans here too, who are kind of caught up, almost as collateral damage of the famine.
So I have it's not really a question, but it's something to note here from Bob, that some cemeteries are also notable for Irish immigrants for that time period. And he makes reference to Find a Grave, St. Joseph's Catholic Cemetery. So cemetery records and church records are also a very good source of information for this time period before official registration.
Absolutely. And one of the ones I've been looking at, and I found the Hadwin girls, their father, he's in the Potter's Field Cemetery in Toronto. And those registers are still there. And interestingly, occasionally you see mention that the immigrant agency is paying for the burial, but not always. This man, his burial was not paid for. So it's kind of interesting because like that would have been the signal that this is a new immigrant, but there are definitely immigrants in there who obviously had someone to take care of the burial for them. So yeah, cemetery records are absolutely a great source for these for this time period.
Okay, it's Kathy here. Wilhelmina Laurie has asked, are there lists for Kingston quarantine sheds or hospital deaths?
So not in 1847 as much as there are for other years. And I can't speak to the specifics because we've been focusing on 1847, but Kingston absolutely shows up in the earlier years. It's kind of too bad, actually, because Kingston was sort of the central hub. The chief immigrant agent, Anthony Hawke, was stationed there, and we have his letter books, right? We have his correspondence from Kingston at the time, but we don't have the transportation receipts, unfortunately, for 1847, but they are there for earlier years.
So Laura, you and I had a conversation about that once, and we were wondering if they were just became so overwhelmed there in Kingston that the record keeping fell apart.
It's possible. I also know that not all of these records were digitized. And I know there are 2 more boxes at Library and Archives Canada that might very well hold the Kingston papers. I mean, I kind of fantasize about that a little bit, but yeah, I mean, you really see the panic, particularly in those burial registers. I have looked at the Kingston one and the Coburg one, both of the Catholic burial registers, and they start out quite nice, you know, nice as burial records can be. But as things kind of heat up, you see just scribbles, or just 6 people buried today, or, you know, or nothing, you know, like you can tell that there's sort of things get difficult and it's hard to keep decent records. And so it is almost a miracle that these records exist at all, have survived this long.
Okay, we have a question from Barb Tedhope. She's asking, my family came to Ontario Oro Township in 1832. Would their circumstances to come to Canada be different than those who came in 1847?
Depends. I mean, as much as we know the famine was a terrible time, ultimately to get across the Atlantic, you needed to have the means to do so. You needed to either have the money to do so, or you needed to have someone be able to pay for you to do that. So it entirely depends. Yeah, there were lots of reasons why people came over in the 1830s that were, you know, there were famines in the 1820s and 1830s as well. So it is entirely possible that it would have been a similar circumstance. Maybe not as difficult. The conditions maybe weren't as difficult. They might not have met an immigrant agent. The 1830s are kind of a bit early for that system. So they might not have had sort of that safety net in place to help them. But possibly they had similar strategies in terms of going to someone they knew, or going to a place where they knew of someone, which is totally common for migrants of all eras, really.
Okay, we have a question from Dennis Donovan asking, have you looked at the records for Maidstone Cross?
You know what? Not for this project. I know lots about Maidstone from my dissertation work for my PhD. Maidstone is fantastic. For those of you who don't know, it's an Irish settlement in Essex County, just outside of Windsor. And so Maidstone was pretty special in that it's an entirely French, it's a French area. And so these sort of upstart Irish sort of show up in the 1820s and settle there and sort of make their place, right? So these records, because they're so centered on Lake Ontario, we only kind of see people going to these sort of peripheral areas to Lake Ontario, but there are some records for people ending up down on Lake Erie on Port Stanley, but not as far as Windsor or Maidstone. That said, many places had immigrants come, and we know that because they were forced to start up boards of health to receive immigrants. So that sort of thing shows up in the newspapers, but it's not present in these records, that's for sure.
Okay, thank you. Wesley Johnston asked, when did the service records begin? They seem like a possible good source even before the famine.
Yeah, well, these records, has survived, they begin in 1843. And so I'm not totally sure if the immigrant agencies would have predated that. It's something I need to look into, but 1843 is when they start. And 1847 is sort of the end of the really great records. And then there's sort of smatterings of documents into the early 1850s in this collection.
Okay, Trish Ashbury, she asks or says, my ancestors lived in Enniskillen, Fermanagh. Ireland, but I don't know when they immigrated. Were ships designated to certain areas of Ireland, or did everyone organize their own immigration? Really interesting presentation. Thank you.
That's a huge question. It could, you know what, the answer is yes to all of those things. There was many different ways that people left Ireland to come to Canada. They did it on their own steam. A landlord helped them or forced them. And lots of other, or someone, they got remittances from someone they already knew here in Canada or in the United States, sent them money in order, and sent them a ticket passage in order to come to Canada. So it is difficult to know. Many Irish went to England first before they were able to, actually it was cheaper to go to England, so many just went to England and stayed. But often that would be, you'd kind of go make some more money and then come to Canada. So figuring out how they came from Fermanagh to Canada, that's a huge task, and I wish you luck.
Marge Zook asks, are you speaking of Simcoe County or the town of Simcoe, which is elsewhere?
Simcoe County.
Okay, that was a easy one.
That was easy.
Doreen Colquette, my great-grandmother immigrated with her parents and siblings from County Wicklow, the Lord Fitzwilliam estate, to the Bytown area before 1847. Are these families included?
You know what? I don't know the answer to that. They might, but I would suspect not. Only because I've looked for other organized immigrations like that. Like this, there's a group of immigrants who are sent out of the Strokestown estate as well, and they're not in here. So it makes me think that because if they were sponsored by Fitzwilliam, that might have been a separate thing that was kept out of this sort of. But again, I don't want to say no, like absolutely no, but I would be surprised if they were.
Okay, and our own Cindy has a question. Is there a time frame for this project?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we are spending 2022 looking at the genealogical, doing the genealogical searches, trying to look for as many of the 1400 as we can. And then 2023 we'll spend on sort of the data crunching, the analysis, and the deeper dives into the individuals we've decided to search further. Then we'll be able to get the exhibit up and running. But in terms of timeline, actually, for volunteers, we're expecting it would take people to take about a month, maybe to do the searching. But again, we've got a little bit of time, so we're really happy if anyone's able to jump in and give us a hand for even some of that time.
Okay, and Gladys Johnson asks, are there similar records available for Irish immigrants to Ontario in the late 1820s and early 1830s?
Unfortunately, I don't think so. At least I haven't come across them. 1820s and 1830s was my my area for my dissertation research, and I have not come across anything yet. Absolutely, that would be amazing if it was. But so far, I haven't come across anything.
Okay, thanks. Carol Walker asks, are there records for Irish immigrants that came to East Garafraxa Township in the 1840s?
I'm not sure. What do you think, Charmaine?
Well, somebody's going to have to help me out because I'm not quite sure what county that's in at the moment. Somebody know that?
Can you put it in the chat?
Well, I think it's if East Scarifaxa is part of Simcoe County, Peterborough, Kawartha, Northumberland, Peel, or York Township, then there may be some records in here. But outside of that, there are not very many. And that's my understanding, Laura.
Okay, a question from Lori Kay. How detailed are the Grosse Ile records was every immigrant recorded?
That's a great question, and I don't actually know the answer. I've only really started to kind of dive into the gross seal records as I look for these people, and they seem to be fairly extensive as far as I can tell, but I'm not an expert in the gross seal records. I haven't spent enough time with them, but there's a decent database on the Library and Archives Canada website that includes many different sources of information for gross seal, and it covers quite a large time frame as well. So if you haven't seen that, you should take a look.
Okay, Cindy Cartwright asks, are you going to do anything for Irish immigrants who arrived in Canada before 1840?
Not for this project. We've decided to focus on 1847 just because it was the penultimate year of the Irish famine and of Irish migration to Canada for the most part. So we had to narrow it somehow, as much as I would love to have done the whole thing. Unfortunately, we're just going to have to focus on 1847.
Well, and the other thing is the 175th anniversary of the famine is coming up in 2022. So 175th anniversary of 1847 in any case.
Exactly, yeah.
Another reason to focus on. Kathy, if you've still got more questions, I have a bunch that have come directly to me, so I can, or do you still have more to go?
I still have some more, yeah.
Okay, go ahead.
Kathy Coleman stated her ancestors came over from Ireland in 1847. However, they settled in Quebec. I assume you're not researching immigrants other than those settling in Ontario.
No, and there are some records in this group for Quebec, but not many. And the ones that are there are not for transportation. They're for things like this woman needed clothing for her children, or there are people being sent back to Ireland, which is sort of interesting and something I'd love to look into further, but there isn't much on Quebec here. This is almost entirely a collection of records for Ontario.
Look like Claire Burchell asks, are there records for 1849 or 1850?
Yes, but not much. Really, I think the other day I searched 1850 and there were 25 names, and that was it. So it's pretty sparse when we get past 1847, and there are reasons for that. For the most part, this migration management system was shut down. So they started to handle immigration in a different way after 1848, I believe. So the records are pretty sparse after 1848.
Okay, this one is from Wilhelmina Laurie, and it's a bit specific, but have you done much research on families moving to the Huron Tract? Our Buchanan ancestors settled in Elma Township as the first family settling in the Queen's Bush. They traveled through to Fogle Inn in near current day Shakespeare.
These records don't reach the Huron Tract, but that's not to say that these immigrants might not have made it there. The government was only able to or willing to facilitate travel so far, right? Like they really struggled with how much money do we spend on this? Like, how much do we help? Like, I mean, this is a time when really there's no social welfare state, right? And so it's sort of above and beyond as far as they're concerned to be helping in any way. Actually, Mark McGowan, who is a historian of the Irish in Canada also, he's been having his students at U of T research Irish famine in immigrants in the Huron Tract. So it's definitely clear that they made it there, and that was a significant area of settlement for because it was a possible area for settlement, right? But these people in these records, they're not making it that far in these records, right? But we may find that many of these people went further and ended up on the Huron Tract.
Okay, I think we probably only got time for a couple of more questions. Wesley asks, what portion are you successful with in finding the port of embarkation in Ireland?
So that'll be our kind of second stage. I personally, I can't help myself. So as you saw, I looked up Darby Moffat to try and figure out where he had come from. I had the hint in the obituary, but I did find them in the tithe books, and I found the birth records for all his children in Sligo. But I think that'll be part of the second round. Like once we've determined who we want to search, we'll start looking for them in Ireland. But yeah, that's absolutely something I want to build in as well, because understanding the origins of these immigrants will be important and interesting.
Okay, and this will have to be our last question. Would an immigrant coming over in 1847 get work as a laborer on a farm, or is there a way they could have bought land cheap? And in the 1851 census, what is the difference between farmer and laborer? Would a farmer be a farm owner or a farm employee?
I think Charmaine is the census expert between us, but I would wager that a farmer is someone who holds land, and a laborer is someone who works on land.
The OGS just did a census course, and the definitions change between farmer and laborer, and whether a farmer's son is designated as a farmer or a laborer according to the individual census. So the only way to find that out is to go to the Library and Archives Canada page for that census and look up the instructions to the enumerators.
Yeah.
Because for different censuses, it was handled different ways. And I don't have that memorized off the top of my head, which censuses handled it which way. So the best way is to go to Library and Archives Canada and look it up.
But I should answer the first part of the question, which was, what were the chances of someone finding work? And from what I've read in the newspapers, not great. There's a lot of, in Hamilton, for example, there's reports that people just start coming back. The Hamilton are saying, hey, we sent all these people out of here. Why are they coming back? And it's because they can't find work in the rural townships. Part of the problem is people don't want to, first, people can't afford to hire, they don't want to hire strangers. They can't afford to do it. And then there starts to be reports in the newspaper. A lot of these immigrants have typhus, and there's reports about people who've taken immigrants in, and it's decimated their typhus has run through the family and everybody has died. And so there's this stigma against Irish famine immigrants in the rural townships. You don't want to take in a stranger who might happen to be sick. And so the chances of that, actually, there's also reports that the Irish famine immigrants are often too ill or too undernourished to be able to do the work. And so there's also reports in Toronto, at least, of people coming back into the city to go into the hospital because they've worked for a day or two and they can't handle it. So that idea that there was ready work in the rural townships is really problematic. Not to mention, if you show up in November, there's not going to be much work for you in a rural township. And finally, what are the chances of them having land? That was the other part of the question. I would have said not, but in the 1851 census, we're starting to find some of these immigrants. They've got some, and by 1851, by 1861. And so it begs the question, I think, just how destitute were some of these people? It's hard to know. And so that's something that we're going to look into a little bit further. And as you saw in some of those records, people came with bags or with baggage as well. So it's really challenging our sort of vision or imagining of, people fleeing famine with just the rags on their backs, like people who made it to Ontario, they had come a long way. And so they probably had some resources, physical and mental and financial to do that. Hopefully that answered that question.
Yes, I think so. Thank you. We'll have to stop the questions here. Thank you so much for answering. Cindy, are you going to close off here?
Cindy, can I just mention that any questions that we didn't get to, there were about 17 in the chat that I could see. If people want to send those to me, if I can't answer them, I'll pass them on to Laura. And I put my email in the chat, but it's C Lindsay, and Lindsay is spelled SAY, 29@hotmail.ca. So if we weren't able to get to your question tonight, send them to me, and I'll make sure that we can answer them for you.
That's great. I was just going to remind people to do the same thing. So thank you. Just want to remind people as well that we did record this presentation. It will be available once it's edited on the Ireland SIG's YouTube channel, as well as it will be available on the Canadian Ireland Foundation website. And then we're also going to try to put a link to it on our website as well, as long as fingers crossed we can figure out how to do that. And just truly thank you for joining us, ladies. Hopefully people will take the time to volunteer. Winter's coming, so we will all be snowbound shortly. And this was a good project. I'm sure working with you and volunteering with you hones some skills. So I think it might be a good educational opportunity for the researchers as well. So as I said, thank you so much for joining us. If people have questions, don't hesitate to send them to Charmaine. And thank you everyone for joining us tonight. Thank you ladies for your time, and Kim for hosting, and Kathy for monitoring the questions. So thank you everyone, and we'll say good night now. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Good night.
Bye.